Tonight, I want to begin with a floor, not with a crown glittering in a chapel, not with a battlefield of banners and iron, not with a wedding feast or a royal funeral, but with a floor beneath the feet of important people. An old wooden floor in a medieval hall. An old medieval hall, lit by candles and watched by stone walls. A floor that has listened for years to arguments, judgments, petitions, murmured alliances, solemn prayers, whispered insults, and all the little sounds that gather whenever men of rank convince themselves that the world is stable because they are standing on top of it. It is late enough in the day that the light beyond the windows has thinned into a deep blue quiet. Candles burn in iron holders, warm amber light collects on carved beams, wool cloaks, polished rings, thick boots, and pale parchment folded on a bench. The air smells of wax, timber, old rushes, damp stone, and the faint trace of cold air that slips in whenever a door opens and closes. Somewhere beyond a narrow corridor, a servant waits in stillness. Somewhere behind the wall, a horse shifts in straw. Somewhere farther off, perhaps below the rise on which the hall stands, a river moves through darkness, indifferent and patient. Inside, the room appears safe. A bishop lowers his hand after making a point no one wishes to contradict openly. A nobleman leans closer to another, their voices nearly lost in the soft thickness of the hall. A clerk presses one sheet of parchment against another, careful not to smudge the ink. Someone coughs. Someone glances toward the ruler's chair. Someone adjusts a belt or a sleeve or a sword strap gadget. Everything belongs to that ancient theater of authority in which the right people stand in the right places, speak in the right order, and allow the architecture around them to confirm the fiction that hierarchy is natural, durable, and firm. And yet, there is always something hidden beneath ceremony. A being darkened by age, a joint weakened by time, a strain that no one noticed because the hall has always held before. It is one of the quietest truths in history that old things often fail at the very moment when everyone has stopped imagining failure. Stability feels strongest just before it reveals how much of itself depended on habit, repetition, and trust. Perhaps there is a sound, but too small to matter, a little complaint in the grain of the wood, a tiny answer to too much pressure, a softness underfoot no one interprets correctly. The room goes on, the candles go on, the voices go on. Then, in the space of a breath, the floor begins to give way. Dust rises first, perhaps, then a crack, then a lurch, then the whole surface under those important feet opens into darkness, splinter, terror, and a humiliating awareness that rank means very little while falling. Great men reach for balance and find only air, timber breaks, voices turn into cries, light swings, bodies disappear downward. The hall that held so much dignity reveals what lies beneath it. Weakness, rot, pressure, and the simple fact that gravity does not care how carefully a kingdom has arranged itself. That, tonight, is the world I want to lead you through. Because medieval scandal, whether in England or in France, so often feels like that moment. A floor that everyone trusted beginning to fail. A structure that looks solid turning uncertain under human weight. A crown resting on symbolic beams that were older and weaker than anyone wanted to admit. A marriage decorated with ceremony, but hollowed by appetite. A family tree that looked impressive from a distance, but cracked from within. An alliance upheld by public language and undermined by private resentment. A sacred order that spoke of eternity while depending on people who were frightened, desirous, proud, lonely, ambitious, humiliated, impulsive, or simply too human to carry the roles they had inherited. Tonight, we will move slowly through that older world. Not as through a list of crimes, not as through a sequence of violent curiosities, not as through a bright lecture that asks the mind to stand fully upright and follow every day. Instead, we will move the way candle smoke moves through a hall, slowly, softly, touching one surface after another. We will pass through medieval England and medieval France, through towers, forests, chapels, coronation feasts, marriage beds, prisons, abbeys, royal chambers, and long roads between cities. We will see how scandal followed kings and queens, not because they were uniquely monstrous, but because the society around them asked their bodies, marriages, tempers, and reputations to carry the stability of whole realms. You do not need to memorize anything tonight. You do not need to sort every dynasty neatly. You do not need to follow every succession crisis as if it were a puzzle to solve before sleep. It is enough to feel the texture of the old world, stone and timber, wax and wool, bells and water, seals and letters, whispered accusations. Long winters, great churches, narrow corridors, hidden chambers, and everywhere. The sense that a private failing in a royal house could become public danger. Because medieval kingship was not only government. It was performance, blessing, inheritance, memory, and faith held together by collective agreement. That is why scandal mattered so much. In a modern setting, a rumor may embarrass. In the medieval world, a rumor could destabilize succession. A prince's disappearance could taint a dynasty. A king's marriage could provoke the pope. A queen's humiliation could change the imagination of a court. A churchman's blood on cathedral stone could force a monarch into penance. A ruler's intimacy with Wade, a favorite, could become a question of legitimacy, judgment, masculinity, and public trust. Even those who did not see events directly could feel their consequences as they spread outward through sermons, letters, chronicles, gossip, noble alliances, and the little frightened calculations made inside hundreds of households. Kings, especially, lived under symbolic pressure. A king was expected to be more than a man with armed supporters. He was supposed to embody order. He was supposed to stand at the point where bloodline, law, justice, war, fertility, sacred blessing, and public dignity met. He was supposed to be father to the realm, judge of conflicts, defender of the church, or sometimes corrector of the church, husband to a queen whose body carried future heirs, and master of a household large enough that everyone watched its smallest motions for signs of strength or weakness. When a king misbehaved, the offense did not stop at the edge of his private life. The whole kingdom felt invited to reinterpret what his rule meant. Queens were burdened no less heavily. A queen's marriage might secure peace between territories. Her pregnancy might steady an entire line. Her reputation for chastity might matter to the legitimacy of princes unborn. Her emotional life, however invisible in theory, could shape factions, loyalties, foreign ties, and domestic tension. If she were insulted, ignored, set aside, accused, betrayed, or turned into an obstacle, then what looked like domestic trouble could become a dynastic storm. In the medieval imagination, queenship and womanhood were often forced to serve as symbols long before they could be allowed the dignity of private feeling. The church, too, watched and judged. Marriage was not merely contract, it was sacrament. Kingship was not merely inheritance, it was blessed. Sin was not merely personal error, it might attract punishment, scandal, disorder, and public shame. A ruler under excommunication carried more than spiritual discomfort. He carried a crack in the moral atmosphere of his reign. Subjects could whisper, princes could rebel with cleaner consciences, enemies could claim that heaven itself had begun to withdraw recognition. All of this is why medieval scandal leaves such deep marks in history. It exposed not only the sins of individuals, but the fragility of the structures around them. And so, tonight, let us begin in England, where few scandals have lingered more darkly than the one that rose from inside the Tower of London. The Tower has a particular silence in the historical imagination. It is not merely a building, it is a place where royal security and royal threat have so often shared the same walls, that one almost expects stone there to keep secrets. In 1483, it became the setting for one of the most disturbing disappearances in European royal history. Edward IV died suddenly, leaving his heir, Edward V, only 12 years old. The boy's younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, was still younger, not yet 10. Their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, stepped forward as Lord Protector. That title sounds comforting if heard at a distance. Protection implies guardianship, steadiness, care, yet in politics, especially dynastic politics, protection can become the mask beneath which possession arranges itself. The young Edward was traveling toward London for his coronation when Gloucester intercepted him. The boy king was brought under his uncle's control. His brother joined him at first. The explanation seemed orderly enough. The princes were to stay within the tower, which could serve as royal lodging before a coronation. No one could yet say with confidence that evil was underway. Medieval people were accustomed to noble children being moved, guarded, instructed, or enclosed for political reasons. And yet, political reason is often the place where innocence begins to disappear. Within weeks, everything shifted. Questions were raised about the legitimacy of Edward IV's marriage. The boys were declared illegitimate. Gloucester took the throne and became Richard III, what should have been a brief period of careful protection before one child's anointing became a stunning reversal. The elder boy, once king in name, lost even that fragile status. The younger vanished with him into the long shadow of his brother's misfortune. Then they were seen less often, then not at all. One can imagine the city's unease, London in summer, crowded but wary, full of rumor moving faster than carts through narrow lanes. Merchants speaking in low voices, servants carrying fragments of news from one household to another, men in taverns pretending to know more than they did, noble partisans trying to read silence, women at windows watching for faces that never reappeared. Every day the boys remained unseen. Absence itself grew heavier. Dominic Mancini, an Italian visitor in England, described the elder boy as behaving like a victim prepared for sacrifice, seeking confession and penance as if he sensed death near him. Whether he truly felt it, or whether observers later cast him in that sorrowful light, the image is difficult to forget. A child who should have been carried forward toward kingship, instead turns inward toward prayer. A crown recedes, the stone around him grows thicker. The adults controlling his future speak in legal and political language, while the boy moves quietly toward the possibility of extinction. No eyewitness left behind a fully certain account of what happened in the final darkness of those rooms. This uncertainty has allowed generations to debate, reinterpret, accuse, and defend. Yet it has never made the scandal smaller. If anything, uncertainty deepens the ache. Richard III benefited from the boys' disappearance. He could not safely allow them to remain visible. He did not produce them alive. Their continued absence poisoned his moral standing, even among some who had reason to support him politically. Later, Tudor writers sharpened everything. Thomas More gave the deed narrative form, describing the boys smothered in sleep. Shakespeare transformed Richard into the archetype of usurping villainy. Those later layers must be read with awareness of propaganda. But propaganda does not grow strong where nothing fertile lies beneath it. The stain was already there. 2 children in the line of succession vanished while under their uncle's protection, and the kingdom drew the conclusion that fear and logic almost demanded. The princes in the tower became more than a suspected murder. They became a symbol of the point at which royal ambition ceases to look like governance and begins to look like hunger. A monarchy is meant to secure the future. Here it appeared to consume it. That is why the story survived, not simply because it is horrifying, but because it captures one of the darkest possibilities inside hereditary rule, that those who stand nearest a crown may find themselves safest only when the rightful heirs can no longer be seen. And yet long before these 2 boys vanished into English memory, England had already learned how dangerous a story could be when attached to the body of a king. So let us go back to the 10th century, to a much younger kingdom and a much younger ruler, Eadwig, crowned in 956, while still in his mid-teens. Youth should have offered freshness. In practice, it offered vulnerability. A teenage king, placed before nobles, bishops, and power-hungry adults, is never merely a teenager. He becomes a surface onto which others may project immaturity. Lust, weakness, hope, reform, or fear, depending on what serves them best. The most famous story about Eadwig begins during his coronation feast, exactly where legitimacy should have been at its strongest. The tale says that the young king abandoned the banquet and was later found in private company with his bride and her mother, in circumstances that later moral writers described with obvious relish. According to the hagiographic tradition around Dunstan, the future saintly archbishop and another churchman had to drag the king back to his own ceremony, restoring him to public duty like a schoolmaster retrieving a wayward student. The image is too perfect not to invite suspicion. A teenage king, a crown cast aside, female sensuality, priestly correction, public shame, every element serves a moralizing narrative. Dunstan's partisans had much to gain from depicting Eadwig as unfit, especially since political divisions later favored his brother Edgar and the church reform movement associated with Dunstan. If a king can be made ridiculous or lustful at the very start of his reign, then resistance to him begins to feel less like ambition and more like guardianship. Historians therefore read the story carefully. Was it true? Was it exaggerated? Did some far smaller act of youthful impulsiveness become embroidered into a full scandal because political enemies required it? We cannot know with complete certainty, but in a sense the deeper truth lies elsewhere. Medieval monarchy depended so heavily on image that the story's factual precision became less important than its emotional effect. Eadwig's authority was weakened by division, by opposition, by the annulment of his marriage, and by early death. The tale of the banquet helped organize those outcomes in memory. It gave moral shape to political failure. There is something sad in that. A young king, who may or may not have done anything so outrageous, enters history wrapped forever in the judgment of older men who found it useful to present him as disorderly. One can imagine the feast hall afterwards, still full of noise and ceremonial leftovers, while somewhere beyond it, the story had already begun its independent life. A story strong enough to survive centuries because it offered chroniclers exactly what they loved: private vice exposed in public glory's own shadow. From the hall of a young king, let us step into another English silence, the New Forest, where William II, called Rufus, rode out hunting and never rode back. The forest is different from the tower. A tower encloses, a forest disperses. It creates gaps between riders, moments without witness. Moving lines of sight, broken by trunks, undergrowth, and distance. Hunting in the medieval world belonged to royal masculinity, privilege, and exhilaration. It also belonged to danger. Men moved quickly. Arrows flew. Accidents could happen. Yet accidents that create opportunities for brothers are rarely remembered as merely accidents. William Rufus was not cherished by many churchmen. He had quarreled with Archbishop Anselm, exploited vacancies in bishoprics, and inspired moral dislike among monastic chroniclers. William Rufus. On the 2nd of August, 1100, he joined a hunting party in the New Forest that included his brother Henry and the nobleman Walter Tyrrell. By sunset the king was dead, struck in the chest by an arrow. Tyrrell fled. The king's body was left behind in the confusion, and only later recovered. At one level, that is simple enough. At another, nothing about the aftermath feels simple. Henry moved at once. He secured the treasury. He went for the crown. Speed in such situations can be read two ways: effective necessity or suspicious readiness. The medieval imagination, never reluctant to join moral meaning to practical advantage, entertained both. Perhaps Tyrrell's shot truly strayed. Perhaps Henry merely recognized fortune and seized it. Or perhaps fortune had been invited. The forest does not answer. Because the evidence could not settle the matter, interpretation rushed into the silence. Monastic writers described William as a wicked king receiving God's judgment. Stories circulated of ominous dreams preceding the hunt. Henry's conduct made some suspect darker planning. Tyrrell's flight seemed guilty. Yet the world moved on with a new king before certainty had any chance to catch up. This is one of the quiet themes running through medieval royal scandal. Time does not wait for truth. The body cools. The crown changes hands. Meaning is assigned while evidence is still scattered under leaves. What William's death showed, and what England remembered, was that kingship could turn in a day when death arrived in ambiguous conditions. A forest, like a tower, can hide too much. It allows scandal to survive because it withholds just enough. From that shadowy death we move into the blaze of a scandal that could not hide, because it unfolded within one of the most visible sacred spaces in England and left a stain too public ever to be denied. The conflict of Henry II and Thomas Becket. Henry II was among the most energetic rulers medieval England produced. A king of law, motion, appetite, and administrative force. Thomas Becket began as his close companion and chancellor, a man associated with royal service rather than ecclesiastical resistance. When Henry made him Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162, he likely expected a trusted ally wearing sacred robes. Instead, he found that office could transform the man within it, or at least reveal a commitment the king had underestimated. As Archbishop, Becket defended church privilege with a stubbornness Henry found intolerable. The question was not trivial: could clerics accused of crime be handled in royal courts? How far could crown authority reach into matters the church considered its own? The issue mattered constitutionally, morally, and symbolically. Henry wanted a more unified, efficient kingship. Becket insisted on the church's separate jurisdiction and dignity. Their quarrel deepened from policy dispute into personal wound. Years passed, exile followed, letters crossed the channel. Reconciliation was attempted in form, but never fully achieved in spirit. Becket returned from France, but he did not return soft. He reasserted himself. He excommunicated some of Henry's allies. He continued to stand as living resistance inside the kingdom to the king's vision of orderly rule. Then came the outburst. Henry, hearing of Becket's latest defiance, spoke in rage words famous ever since. The exact phrasing varies, but the sense remains. Who would rid him of this troublesome priest? We are used, perhaps, in modern life to imagining angry speech as venting, as rhetoric, as private excess. But kings do not speak privately in the same way other men do. Their frustration carries structure behind it. Their irritation can become commission the moment it enters the ears of those who depend on royal favor. 4 knights took the words as enough. They rode to Canterbury. They confronted Becket. He refused to submit. The confrontation entered the cathedral itself. And there, in the sacred hush of that great church, the impossible became real. Swords rose where prayer should have risen. A king's men fell upon the archbishop near the altar. The violence was swift, brutal, sacrilegious. Edward Grimm, present and wounded, described the blows with lasting horror. The skull opened. Blood and brain struck stone. The scene became instantly larger than politics, because sacred space had not protected the victim from royal anger. The scandal moved across Europe like a bell struck too hard. An archbishop murdered in his cathedral by those who believed they served the king. Becket transformed almost at once from controversial churchman into martyr. Pilgrims came, miracles were reported, the church canonized him. Henry did not need to have held the sword to hold the shame. His words had been enough to send violence into the sanctuary. That was what mattered. One of the most fascinating features of this scandal is the king's forced response. Henry II, a ruler of tremendous self-belief, had to bow publicly. He performed penance. He walked barefoot. He submitted to humiliation. Power, which had moved so confidently in him, was bent by the moral outrage his anger had released. The murder of Becket became not only a tragedy but a lesson repeated through generations, that kings may threaten, but they cannot always control how their threats will be enacted, remembered, and judged. Cathedrals keep memory well. The blood was cleaned, the choir resumed, the candles burned again, yet the stones, in imagination, never lost the knowledge. Henry's scandal was not only that a priest died, it was that royal impatience had crossed the threshold into sacrilege. The crown had spoken too hotly, and the church answered by making that heat immortal. After Henry, England gave the world to King John, and with John's scandal ceased to be a single great rupture, and became instead a general climate. John's reputation in English memory is extraordinarily dark. Later legend, including Robin Hood traditions, turned him into the bad king almost by instinct. Modern historians can point to administrative competence, legal sophistication, and political complexity. Yet, a reign may be technically capable and still feel morally contaminated. And that is what John achieved. He made kingship feel unsafe. The first great stain is Arthur of Brittany. Arthur was John's nephew, son of Geoffrey, elder brother to the king, and thus a living alternative around whom opposition could gather. When John captured him in 1202, he took hold of a rival claim embodied in a teenage body. The following year Arthur disappeared. That alone was enough. In dynastic politics, unexplained disappearance under royal control is nearly indistinguishable from implied murder. Chroniclers hostile to John gladly supplied vivid versions of the crime, some claiming he killed Arthur himself and disposed of the body in the river. Whether literally true or not, these accounts stuck because the logic behind them felt persuasive. John had motive. Arthur was gone. France recoiled. His own vassals lost trust. The scandal injured John on several levels. It blackened him morally, weakened him politically, and helped the French King Philip II to strip away Plantagenet holdings on the continent. A ruler thought capable of murdering his nephew no longer seems like the lawful center of a dynasty. He seems like its predator. Then came Matilda de Brao's and her son, a scandal of cruelty that horrified even a hard age. The de Brao's family had fallen out with John. Matilda, according to tradition, remarked that she would never entrust her son to the man suspected of Arthur's destruction. The insult cut to the truth others feared. John responded mercilessly. Matilda and her son were imprisoned and left to starve. Chroniclers described the deaths with images of unbearable waste, the mother and child reduced slowly by deliberate neglect. Some later detail may be exaggerated, but the emotional truth remains. The king's power had become a thing that could isolate a woman and her child until hunger finished the work. It is easy to underestimate how much such a story mattered to a baronial society. Nobles could tolerate harshness in war. They could even endure arrogance. What unsettled them more deeply was the possibility that no household, no wife, no heir, no noble blood would be safe if the king's resentment settled upon them. Under John, punishment appeared arbitrary. The line between justice and private vengeance blurred. Kingship looked less like protection than menace. John's quarrel with the church intensified the feeling. When he refused the Pope's candidate for Archbishop of Canterbury, England was placed under interdict and John himself excommunicated. The realm lived for a time under a strange spiritual dimness. Churches restricted, public worship altered, the king morally suspect in the eyes of many. John eventually submitted and symbolically surrendered his kingdom to the Pope before receiving it back as a papal vassal, an act practical in some respects, humiliating in others. To many of his barons, it confirmed not strength but dishonor. And then Magna Carta emerged, not from abstract philosophy alone, but from accumulated outrage. Clause by clause, the barons sought to place limits around the very arbitrary violence John had made feel possible. He accepted, then tried to undo it. Civil war resumed. He died in 1216. leaving a shattered political landscape and a reputation so deeply compromised that even his son's minority seemed preferable to his continued life. John's scandal, then, was not one deed. It was a reign in which too many acts, suspected murders, imprisonments, humiliations, extortion, lust, church conflict, bad faith, gathered until the crown itself seemed to need protection from the man wearing it. If John represents the terror of abusive kingship, Edward II represents another form of destabilization, the scandal of intimacy and favoritism, loosening royal authority from within. Edward II came to the throne in 1307 as the son of the formidable Edward I, which alone made comparison cruel. He was handsome, musical, emotionally demonstrative, and less conventionally warlike than people expected from an English king. Medieval chroniclers took special offense at rulers who blurred the line between noble conduct and ordinary or rustic interests. Edward's fondness for certain practical, manual, or lowly pursuits became, in hostile memory, one more sign that he failed to inhabit kingship correctly. Yet these quirks alone would not have destroyed him. What did far greater damage was his intense favoritism. First came Piers Gaveston. Edward loved him, that much is clear, whether one understands the love as political dependence, emotional attachment, erotic intimacy, or some medieval mixture modern categories cannot fully contain. What mattered at court was that the king seemed excessively devoted to one man and willing to raise him beyond what the nobility could tolerate. Gaveston received honors, wealth, and attention out of proportion to his rank. At the coronation itself, the imbalance of the king's public regard felt glaring. Queen Isabella, royal bride and symbol of Franco-English alliance, found herself eclipsed by the visible warmth Edward showed the favorite. This was not merely embarrassing, it was politically destructive. Great magnates saw their influence displaced by an upstart, who also appears to have mocked or insulted them. Gaveston's prominence turned resentment into coalition. Banishments were imposed. He returned. Tension sharpened. Eventually he was seized and killed by baronial enemies in 1312. An act both savage and revealing. The kingdom had reached the point where nobles preferred violent correction of the favorite to continued dependence on the king's judgment. Edward grieved, but the pattern did not end. He moved from Gaveston to the Despensers, especially Hugh Despenser the Younger, whose closeness to the king and whose rapacity deepened all existing resentments. The Despensers enriched themselves brutally, using royal favor as shield and weapon. Lands were taken, rivals were humiliated, Queen Isabella herself felt sidelined and dispossessed. Once again, the problem was not private feeling alone. It was the conversion of personal attachment into a system of misrule. By the mid-1320s, the kingdom was exhausted. The barons had been alienated. The queen had become hostile. Isabella, in France, allied with Roger Mortimer, almost certainly in both political and intimate terms. When they invaded England in 1326, the remarkable fact was not that they came, but how little effective loyalty stood in their way. Edward's authority had thinned so completely that it could no longer organize serious resistance. The Despensers were captured and executed with spectacular cruelty. Edward was seized. In 1327, he was forced to abdicate in favor of his son, an unprecedented humiliation in English royal practice. Kings could die, yes, they could be defeated, but formal deposition revealed a deeper wound. It meant the symbolic compact had broken. His death later that year at Berkeley Castle became one of the darkest legends in royal history. The story of the red-hot poker, whether literally true or shaped by later imagination, persisted because it answered medieval moral logic. A king associated in rumor with unnatural intimacies is destroyed in a secret manner that seems to punish the body through which scandal was imagined. Modern historians rightly debate the details and even the certainty of murder itself. Yet the endurance of the tale matters. People believed or half believed it, because Edward had become the sort of king for whom such an ending felt narratively fitting. The pathos of Edward II's reign lies partly in the fact that he was not simply a monster. He was weak in the wrong ways, attached in the wrong directions, unable to subordinate personal loyalties to the brutal architecture of medieval kingship. That made his fall feel tragic rather than merely deserved. But tragedy does not spare scandal, it often intensifies it. So England leaves us with a pattern: the child king lost in stone, the young ruler shaped by hostile narrative, the king dead in the forest, the monarch whose anger made a saint, the tyrant uncle and failed guardian, the ruler who made law look like appetite, the king undone by favorites, by his queen and by himself. Different centuries, different atmospheres, one recurring truth. English kingship rested on belief, and whenever belief weakened, scandal rushed in to explain the crack. Let us rest there for a while. Imagine England now not in the brightness of politics, but in the low light of memory. The Tower by the Thames, dark above the river, the New Forest at dusk, green becoming grey. Canterbury Cathedral after evening prayer. The candles small beneath stone arches. A charter table under winter light, a prison chamber where no answer comes. The old realm feels quieter from here. The names remain. But the urgency has gone. What stays is the knowledge that the crown was never as solid as its gold suggested. Across the water, France offers another mirror, one with different rooms and a different emotional texture. If English scandal often turns on crown, church, and succession, French scandal more often gathers around queen's desire, legal humiliation, marital disorder, courtly display, and the dangerous intimacy between private feeling and public shame. And among the oldest and fiercest of French scandals stands the feud of Brunhild and Fredegund. These two women seem almost too dramatic for ordinary history, which is perhaps why later ages have loved them so much. Brunhild was a Visigothic princess, highborn, politically valuable, brought into Frankish power through marriage. Fredegund rose from humbler origins in the household of King Chilperic. Their world was the violent 6th century, when Frankish kingdoms fractured and competed, and royal marriages were inseparable from war. The spark was already soaked in blood. Chilperic married Galswintha, Brunhild's sister, but Galswintha soon died under suspicious circumstances, most likely murdered so that Fredegund could rise beside the king. That one act gathered together the essential ingredients of the whole long scandal: sex, ambition, dynastic insult, sisterly rage, and the collapse of marriage into elimination. Brunhild, rightly or wrongly, saw Fredegund and Chilperic as destroyers not only of a woman, but of family honor. The feud became political at once. Brunhild's husband Sigebert took up the cause. War flared between rival Frankish courts when Sigeper seemed on the edge of victory. Assassins reached him, and the triumph dissolved. Brunhild fell into captivity, later escaped, and returned to politics through remarriage, regency, and relentless persistence. Fredegund continued to maneuver, bribe, threaten, and survive. Both women became central forces in a world deeply anxious about powerful women, and yet full of conditions that made powerful women unavoidable. The chroniclers give us them through lenses of fear and fascination. Gregory of Tours in particular paints Fredegund in savage colors. Clever, ruthless, murderous, almost the embodiment of court poison. Brunhild receives at times a more regal, even admirable tone, though she too becomes implicated in blood and revenge. Their rivalry is not a simple morality play. It is two women using the limited and dangerous tools available to them in a world where dynastic survival, motherhood, marriage, and political will were all entangled. What makes the feud so enduring is the scale at which intimate hatred became statecraft. Kingdoms rose and fell around it. Children inherited its logic, bloodline itself became weaponized memory. By the time Brunhild was finally defeated in old age by Clotaire II, son of Fredegund, the struggle had hardened into legend. Her execution, torn by horses according to the most famous account, was not merely punishment. It was theatrical annihilation, meant to erase a rival queen and declare the triumph of one line over another in the most spectacular manner possible. The scandal of Brunhild and Fredegund is therefore not simply that queens were violent. It is that queenship itself, supposed to stabilize dynasties through marriage and maternity, became the vehicle of prolonged vengeance. The Frankish kingdom learned the hard way that private passions at the summit of power could reorder whole realms. After that vast old ferocity, let us move into a scandal of a colder kind, one centered not on feud, but on marriage, accusation, and the humiliating use of law against a queen, the case of Lothar II and Thiuberga. Lothar wanted to rid himself of his wife and marry Waldrada, the woman he preferred and with whom he already had children. This alone might sound almost ordinary within royal history, but the medieval church would not treat marriage as so easily disposable, especially when kings tried to dispose of it for dynastic convenience or private desire. If Lothar wanted freedom, he needed grounds, and so he created grounds through accusation. The charges against Thiutberga were extreme: incest with her brother, unnatural acts, pregnancy concealed, a whole bundle of sexual horror, meant not merely to separate a couple, but to make the wife appear morally unfit to have ever been queen. This was legal strategy through reputational destruction. It is one of the coldest recurring patterns in the medieval world, the powerful man who cannot openly say, "I wish to leave," and therefore says instead, "She is monstrous." Thiutberga denied the charges and demanded ordeal. A champion acting for her underwent the test. And in the moral logic of the age, the outcome affirmed her innocence. But innocence is often weaker than a king's persistence. She was pressed further, and at some point, a confession was extracted or induced. Bishops sympathetic to Lothar tried to formalize the king's will. Yet the affair rose beyond local control to Pope Nicholas I, who intervened with firmness and outrage. Thiutberga was restored. Lothar, for all his authority, could not finally bend the sacramental structure to his appetite. This scandal is easy to underestimate because it lacks the bright violence of murder. But it contains a slow and devastating cruelty. A queen is publicly accused of sexual depravity to clear the path for another woman. Her body becomes a battlefield of legal rhetoric. Her innocence matters less than the king's desire, until papal power reverses the arrangement. It is marital scandal, not as gossip, but as public warfare waged through accusation, clerical procedure, and confinement. From that royal misery, let us turn to a very different French scandal, perhaps the most intimate of them all, the story of Abelard and Heloise. Here the setting changes, not a throne room, but Paris, not a kingdom, but a school and a household, not a king, but a famous scholar. Yet scandal is no less potent, because reputations in the intellectual and religious world could also bear heavy symbolic weight. Peter Abelard was brilliant, admired, argumentative, proud of his own mind, one of those men whose self-awareness of genius becomes part of the story. Heloise was astonishingly educated, intellectually alive, living under the care of her uncle Fulbert. Abelard became her tutor. That arrangement, like so many powerful arrangements in history, carried danger within it from the beginning. Admiration and authority stood too close, curiosity and desire found too easy a path into one another. They became lovers. Abelard later wrote of the affair in terms both self-condemning and self-dramatizing. Heloise became pregnant. He took her away to Brittany. They had a child, a secret marriage followed, intended partly to satisfy her uncle and partly to protect Abelard's career. Yet, secrecy rarely calms wounded honor. Fulbert felt betrayed, humiliated, perhaps deceived. His revenge was brutal. Men entered Abelard's chamber at night and castrated him. That act alone would have secured the story's place in memory. But what gives Abelard and Heloise unusual endurance is what came after. He became a monk. She became a nun. The relationship did not vanish. It changed into letters, some of the most moving and intellectually alive letters to survive from the Middle Ages. Heloise, especially, emerges with extraordinary force. She remembers love not as mere sin, but as lived truth. She refuses to let piety erase feeling. Abelard, wounded and aging, tries to reinterpret the whole affair through humility, theology, and acceptance, yet the pain remains legible. Their scandal speaks with a different register than the royal cases. It is less about legitimacy than about memory, less about succession than about emotional truth. Yet it still belongs perfectly in the medieval world we are exploring, because it reveals how even in cloistered and scholarly settings the line between private desire and public consequence was perilously thin. A teacher's passion, a woman's brilliance, a family's honor, the church's standards, and the violence of vengeance all met in one tragic story. Then we return to the French crown and to another king who allowed desire to make a public enemy of the church, Philip I and Bertrada de Montfort. Philip had a lawful wife, Bertha of Holland, and an heir. Bertrada had a husband, the Count of Anjou, yet Philip became infatuated and acted not with discreet caution, but with a kind of royal entitlement, setting Bertha aside and taking Bertrada as though the force of his will should be enough to rearrange sacrament and marriage. The scandal was immediate, because the violation was plain. This was not ambiguity, it was effectively bigamy flaunted by a crowned man. The church condemned him, councils protested, Pope Urban II excommunicated him. That alone reveals how serious the affair was considered. The King of France, one of the central rulers of Latin Christendom, publicly stained because he preferred his own appetite to the law of marriage. Medieval monarchy could survive many things, but visible sexual disorder carried symbolic risk. A king out of order in his bed could be imagined as out of order in the realm. Bertrada became, in hostile telling, the dangerous woman, seductress, manipulator, perhaps even sorceress in it. Later, accusation. It is a familiar pattern. When kings desire unwisely, the woman often bears imaginative blame. Yet the deeper scandal remains Philip's own refusal to let ceremonial and spiritual order govern him. He eventually performed enough submission for the excommunication to be lifted, but the kingdom had already seen its king measured and found wanting in one of the most intimate areas from which public legitimacy sprang. Then came Philip II Augustus and Ingeborg of Denmark, another marriage scandal, but colder, lonelier, and in some ways more haunting. Philip married Ingeborg and almost immediately wanted out. The reasons remain unclear, perhaps personal revulsion, perhaps political reconsideration, perhaps some visceral rejection that later legal arguments only attempted to justify. What matters is the pattern that followed. Philip sought annulment. Ingeborg refused to cooperate with her own erasure. She insisted she was the lawful queen. She was right. Yet rightness did not save her from years of isolation. Philip took another companion, Agnes of Merania, while Ingeborg lived in a kind of suspended humiliation. Queen in title, rejected in practice, convenient to no one but still immovable in law. The Pope intervened, France suffered interdict, negotiation stretched across years. Ingeborg endured. Her scandal is one of the saddest, because it is so prolonged and so quiet. No great public execution, no murder in a cathedral, no thrilling disappearance. Instead, a woman living inside the long administrative cruelty of being unwanted by the most powerful man in her world while remaining bound to him by law and sacrament. Medieval injustice was not always spectacular. Sometimes it came in the form of endless postponement, ignored rights, lonely chambers, and a silence that made a living queen feel already half erased. Now, if we gather the French stories together, a wider mood forms around them. The French court becomes a theater of shame and desire. Curtains drawn around private feeling that can never remain private for long. Queens watched not only as women, but as symbols, kings treating marriage as appetite until the church answers. Mistresses rising high enough to distort the court's moral weather. Old noble feuds turning intimate injury into state violence. Scholars loving where they should instruct, every chamber carrying both elegance and danger, candles burn, silk rustles, legal formulas are written. Priests argue, women wait, men desire, chroniclers sharpen, shame becomes political material. This does not mean France was more scandalous than England in some simple quantitative way. Rather, the French stories preserved in memory often reveal more openly the emotional texture of court, sex, repudiation, and feminine power. If English scandals frequently ask, who should rule? Can the crown survive this? What has happened to royal authority? The French scandals often ask, who is lawful? Who is desired? Who is set aside? Who is shamed? And how can a court go on calling itself ordered while so much of its life is governed by appetite beneath ceremony? Let us pause again before drawing the deeper line through both kingdoms. The names are many now, the stories are crowded, yet they are beginning, perhaps, to settle into pattern. That is good. History for sleep should not feel like a bag of sharp objects. It should begin with curiosity and end in drift. So let the names soften a little. Richard and the Two Lost Princes, Eadwig and the dangerous story told about youth, William and the forest, Henry and Becket in the cathedral, John and the ruinous feeling of tyranny, Edward and the collapse of a crown through misplaced intimacy, Brunhild and Fredegund burning through kingdoms, Theudberga accused so a king might feel free, Heloise riding across loss, Bertrada moving through scandal beside a king, Ingeborg waiting in lawful loneliness, different chambers, different lights, the same old strain beneath the boards, and now we arrive at the deeper medieval pattern. The world asked too much of symbolic roles. It asked kings to be men, and more than men, fathers and judges and warriors and moral centers and embodiments of divine order. It asked queens to be wives and wombs and diplomats and icons of chastity and continuity. It asked marriages to satisfy desire, politics, inheritance, sacrament, and prestige all at once. It asked archbishops to be holy while standing near power. It asked sons to obey fathers while preparing to replace them. It asked favorites to remain invisible while enjoying royal love. It asked households to appear disciplined while filled with ordinary appetite and fear. It asked human beings to carry eternal meanings in temporary flesh. No wonder the beams cracked. That, perhaps, is what scandal really reveals in the medieval world. Not simply wickedness weight, too much symbolic weight on human structures, never built to hold it indefinitely. A king's body means too much. A queen's bed means too much. A prince's birth means too much. A rumor means too much. A friendship between ruler and churchman means too much. The system loads moral and political significance into every visible arrangement. And then ordinary human weakness leans against those arrangements until something groans. This is why the scandals repeat in different costume. A missing prince, a murdered nephew, a set-aside queen, a lover too close to the throne, a favorite who eclipses law, a king who speaks too angrily, a church that refuses to bend, a marriage unmade by accusation, a feud carried by women, because the men around them will not cease making war. Behind them all is the same discovery. Structure is not stability. Ceremony is not strength. Gold is not certainty. A hall may be grand and still fail from underneath. The opening floor returns here not as anecdote alone, but as explanation. A room may look solid because all inside it agree to treat it that way. A kingdom functions similarly, so long as enough people believe the king is rightful, the queen honorable, the heirs legitimate, the marriage lawful, the church satisfied enough, the nobles contained enough. The image of order can continue. But belief is not stone. It can be weakened by blood, lust, secrecy, humiliation, disappearance, injustice, and badly managed rage. Once enough, people suspect the boards are unsound. Each footstep feels different. Even silence becomes accusatory. And yet, despite all this, the old kingdoms endured. That is another soft truth worth keeping tonight. Medieval England and France were not shattered by every scandal. They bent, they recoiled, they adapted. Another king was crowned. Another queen bore children. Another charter was sealed. Another bishop preached. Another marriage was arranged. Another road carried envoys into the next crisis. Institutions survive not because they are pure, but because people continue to perform them long after purity has become impossible. The Middle Ages knew this even when they pretended not to. After each shock, the candles were relit, the halls were swept, the bodies were buried, the letters were copied, the laws were argued. The crown remained. What is scandal, after all, but the moment when order is forced to remember what it would rather forget? That it has always been improvised from fragile things. Now the story can begin to loosen. The tower stands farther away. The New Forest sinks into evening mist. Canterbury's stone cools under moonlight. The royal prison becomes only another dark room beneath history. Across the channel, the Frankish feud fades into torchlight and hoarse breath, and old vengeance no longer urgent. A queen once accused no longer hears the accusation. A scholar's wound no longer bleeds. A French queen no longer waits to be restored. The bishops stop writing. The popes stop condemning. The mistresses stop moving through those corridors. The servants stop whispering. The roads empty. The horses grow still. What remains then, if not scandal itself, is the atmosphere in which scandal once mattered. The bells, the river, the wax, the corridor, the draught beneath a door, the bedchamber curtain stirring slightly in the night, the rustle of parchment in a clerk's hand, the glance between courtiers who know more than they should say aloud. The sense that kingdoms, for all their grandeur, lived very close to the threshold between order and embarrassment. That threshold is where medieval history becomes especially human. It is easy to look at kings and queens from a distance and turn them into symbols. Yet, symbols grow drowsier at night. At night, they become people again. A boy king frightened in a tower. A teenage ruler shamed by a story perhaps larger than truth. A monarch in the forest who does not know he has ridden into his final afternoon. An archbishop at prayer. A king who says too much. A woman unjustly accused and forced to wait on the church's defense. A scholar still in love after mutilation. A queen lying awake in a foreign court, wondering whether law will ever become kindness. An old rival queen carrying decades of vengeance in a body already tired. Seen like this, the scandal changes. It becomes not only drama, but sorrow, not only politics, but burden, not only sin, but the human failure of roles too large to carry cleanly. And perhaps that is the safest way to leave these stories. Not in judgment, not in triumph, not in the thrill of their grotesque details, but in the calmer recognition that the Middle Ages were full of people trying to make permanence out of unstable things. Wood, wax, inheritance, desire, law, pride, sacrament, fear. These were the materials. They raised kingdoms from them. They crowned rulers through them. They also watched them fail through them. The rivers went on regardless. That is one of the most soothing thoughts in history. The Thames went on past the tower whether princes vanished or not. Rivers beyond the New Forest went on whether a king lived or died. Waters near Canterbury reflected the sky even when the church beneath it throbbed with scandal. In France, the streams and rivers went on past abbeys, courts, and old fields where queens' decisions once mattered terribly. Water does not care for legitimacy. It listens to human anxiety and then carries the weather forward. The bells went on too, cathedral bells, abbey bells, village bells, bells that rang while kings were crowned, bells that rang while wives were set aside, bells that rang while nobles whispered rebellion, bells that rang while students loved in secret, bells that rang under excommunication, under interdict, under mourning, under feast, under rumor. Bronze survives the tempers of those who hear it. Sound leaves the tower, touches roofs and rivers, then thins into nothing. It is hard to think of a better image for scandal itself, once loud, then echo, then air. And the roads went on, royal roads, forest tracks, pilgrim ways, wet lanes leading to monasteries, hard roads carrying envoys with bad news, paths by which murderers fled, bishops traveled, queens moved under guard, boys were escorted, letters crossed borders, and kings rode toward coronation or disaster. Roads connect one chamber of human seriousness to another. Then night takes them too. Night is perhaps the largest thing in this entire story. Night over the tower, night over Canterbury, night over the New Forest, night over the Frankish camps, night over Paris, night over a queen's chamber in France, night over a clerk's desk, night over all those halls and courts where voices once rose high and urgent, as though the world itself depended on the next decision. Night waited beyond every window, patient, vast, indifferent to bloodline and title. When the speeches ended, when the candles burned low, when the guards changed shifts, when even the sleepless finally shut their eyes, night remained. It remains now too, so let the old scandals sink beneath it. Let the princes pass back into shadow. Let the forest close. Let the altar stand empty. Let the charters curl slightly in the cold. Let John's bitterness dissolve into rain against stone. Let Edward's fallen crown grow dim in memory. Let Brunhild and Fredegund become two far lights on different hills. Let Theodberga leave behind the accusations. Let Heloise set down her pen. Let Bertrada and Ingeborg step out of the court and into silence. Let every corridor empty. Let every closed door stay closed. Let every rumor lose its last sharp edge. The hall from the beginning is quiet now. No one is standing there. No bishop, no lord, no attendant, no clerk. The candles are shorter. The wax has cooled. The draughts move more freely. The floor, whatever it once carried, no longer needs to carry anyone. It has done its work and shown its truth. Beneath grandeur there was always strain. Beneath order there was always uncertainty. Beneath scandal there was always simply the old human problem of trying to stand securely on things never wholly secure. Crowns were heavy, vows were fragile, public honor could break faster than stone, but night was always larger than the noise of courts. And now, night has taken all of it, so let medieval England and France drift slowly away from the mind. Let the towers and cathedrals and abbeys and feasting halls recede into blue darkness. Let the bells sound once more, then farther away, then farther still. Let the rivers move on beneath bridges, no longer watched by those who feared or desired crowns. Let the roads go empty. Let the fires in the hearth settle red, then black. Let the final letter be folded. Let the final servant leave the chamber. Let the final anxious ruler, somewhere in that distant world, stop thinking long enough at last to sleep. And you may do the same. The old halls are gentle now. The old scandals are quiet now. The old kingdoms are far enough away. There is only the deep blue of night, the amber memory of candles, the soft patience of stone, and the distant river carrying everything onward until even the heaviest crown becomes no more than a vanished reflection on dark water, and everything at last becomes still enough to rest.